All right. So, having seen what this very seminal text by Peter Ekeh is about, I think it's a good point to invite discussion. A good point to invite comrade Manzi. What were your impressions? Going through the reading. What were your impressions? Just engaging with some of the insights from the material by Ekeh. So you're muted.
All right. Thank you. I just noticed that. So I am grateful for the invitation to share my 2 cents on Ekeh's seminal work. I must begin by pointing out how, probably like many readers, this was my first time encountering Ekeh. And it was just very intriguing and very impressive to discover how deeply analytical at the time this piece must have been to the intellectual public of Africa and the global south at the time, and the world as well in general, because Ekeh was writing from the vantage point of an intellectual based on the continent, an intellectual whose lived experience was organic in every way, who was not sequestered far away in a metropolitan capital or educational institution, simply spectating on African life and African society and the way politics was evolving and metamorphosing on the continent. He was embedded deep within African society, and so he was a player in addition to being a commentator. So I think that is the greatest uniqueness of this piece, in addition to just how original his thesis on, I'm sure what you have already explained to our readers as the two publics is, how he's able to isolate this binary of interests that are simultaneously competing but also simultaneously collaborating to create a kind of a balanced power conspiracy that Africa has to date, in many senses of the word, not recovered from. So my point of departure, therefore, will be that that concept of Ekeh setting up this clash of players on the African colonial landscape. On the one hand, we have a bourgeoisie that is foreign, European to be specific, and then on the other hand, we have them therefore playing God and creating a native bourgeoisie that is in many ways their image. And so we have in that move an attempt to externalize a domestic problem to Europe. Europe, I imagine, has not in any way benefited from having evolved a bourgeoisie. If the evolution of a bourgeoisie were to be put on a scale, you'd have the negatives outweighing the positives over historical time. And so Europe then going ahead to transplant that sociological problem of having a bourgeoisie and then impose it on the colonized societies, I think is a very, very great disservice, because that bourgeoisie has then gone ahead to play exactly the same extractive role, the same role of blocking any genuine social evolution, any distributive attempts by African society to organize and create a fairer, more egalitarian society has been successfully
Yeah.
blocked by a bourgeoisie that is in political control and that
Yeah.
has full control of the means of production.
Yeah, comrade, on that point, you know, there seems, and we offer known for this analysis because he addresses this question of the national middle class that takes on power, who takes on the
Yeah.
apparatus of the colonial state, in the immediate aftermath of independence. But there's clearly a distinction between the African, bourgeoisie that takes on the state and the bourgeoisie of the West, of the metropoles, because you find out that in most of these cases they have a productive class, they have a true national bourgeoisie that can drive development. But then on the continent we are still stuck with what in most Marxist analysis we call compradors, middlemen, traders, right, who still maintain the same relationship that the colonizers had with the state, because the state, as we mentioned, that the state was always extractive, right? It took away from people. It was exploitative, in its relationship to the people, and so people now have this animosity towards the state, right? We can loot the state with no problems, and we go to bed and sleep well at night with no problems at all. So you find out that what is supposed to be our national bourgeoisie, our national middle class that is now running the state, maintains that extractive relationship like the colonizers had, but without really giving back meaningfully to the national project, right? So it's not even that it's like they don't share character at all. Like our bourgeoisie on the continent does not share the same character as the national bourgeoisie elsewhere. Like people who run the economies of the West are very productive. Like these guys are driving industry. Obviously now capitalism has reached the phase of financialization, so we can argue that may not be the same relationship, right? But it's essentially not the same thing. These guys here have more extractive, they have maintained the colonial character of the state in its exploitative relationship with the public, with the primordial public, and they still continue giving back to that primordial public, but they don't look at all like their grandfathers in Europe.
Well, that's a very correct analysis to the extent that we look at the consequences of the actions of the bourgeoisie. But perhaps we are not appreciating the historicity of Europe's bourgeoisie enough if we only study it and analyze it in its present form. Of course, Europe's bourgeoisie today plays an impressive role of keeping a system that is exploiting the rest of the world working for domestic Europeans. But my argument would be, and again, I'm going to show how Ekeh as well is thinking in this line, would be that up to at least the second half of the 19th century, European bourgeoisie, which had been many centuries or many decades in the making up to that point, had been doing exactly what African and post-colonial bourgeoisie is doing today. They had been exploiting their own working classes, exploiting their own underclasses. And if, for example, one looks at the human development indicators in the average European country in 1900, they were not any different from human development indicators in Kampala or in Lagos or in Burma. Today, the average life expectancy was not anywhere higher than 50 years old. You didn't have universal suffrage for many national minorities. Women were not allowed to vote. There was widespread child labor. Children as young as 4 years old were working in British cotton mills and in the nascent British industry at the time of Europe's first industrial revolution. There was widespread disease among the working classes and the underclasses. So poverty Both rural and urban was widespread. Slums were the order of the day in the average European capital. So what happened with European colonization of the New World, of Africa, of Asia, was that the bourgeoisie externalized their exploitation of their domestic working classes. So that the conquest of Africa, the conquest of Asia, then became a form of transferring the suffering and the exploitation of the average European to all Africans and all conquered peoples in Asia and in South America and in the other parts of the global South from that point onwards. So I do not think that the European bourgeoisie in its actual nature is any different from the African bourgeoisie. The only reason the African bourgeoisie, I suppose, is performing as badly as it is compared to its European counterparts is that it has not effectively found ways to externalize its exploitation from its own national underclasses, which Europe was successfully able to do with colonization of the rest of the world. Unfortunately, Africa is now the last frontier of exploitation. We do not have anyone lower on the pyramid of humanity to go and invade. But Africa perhaps is trying to resolve that contradiction by what Ekeh points out as these two national publics. You know, on the one hand, the primordial, which is the tribe and the ethnic group, becomes then the in-group. And then the second public, you'll correct me, did he call it the common public?
The civic.
Yes, the civic public. Yes, the civic public, which is the state, the colonial state, you know, which is multinational and heterogeneous, then becomes the arena of exploitation. So an ethnic representative, member of a primordial bourgeoisie, then goes out, captures the state together with their clansmen, and then that civic public becomes an arena of exploitation, and the in-group is the primordial public. You bring resources back to the clan and back to the tribe. And so that is exactly the form of domestic colonization that is playing out in Africa. I would,
Comrade, just to take you back a bit, I would add that the other difference essentially also with our national bourgeoisie, if that's what we want to term the people who have taken on the state, is also the economic power, right? There might be a similarity, as you pointed out, in the exploitative relationship in regards to the people, right? That there is this, class of people that the ruling class essentially, they're not doing any kindness at all to the people at the grassroots in both geographical localities, right? But also the other difference is economic power. The European bourgeoisie has economic might. And so now in Fanon's analysis, you see that ultimately they just become middlemen of global capital. Because if you think about, for example, our ruling class in Uganda, when you have a local capitalist or businessman, like where are they getting their money from? Like where are they actually getting their money from? Do they even have the power to drive industrialization? Look at our current conversation, for example, in Uganda, in terms of our developmental strategy. We are mainly relying on FDI. Every African country is trying to see how beautiful they can make themselves for foreign capital. That's because we don't have an organic national bourgeoisie that can drive that process on the continent. And that's also not, it's also not by coincidence. It's a product of colonial design, right? One of the things when we were introducing this discussion was to say that we need to, historical analysis is very important. And that's what Ekeh is helping us here with, right? Now let's go back to history to think about how we've come to be at the place where we are today. And it's very important, right? Because when the colonial state existed then, it did not really foster an organic national middle class. The people who took over power at independence were not businessmen. They are not people with the kind of thinking that the European bourgeoisie has, right? They are just people who are, and you've spoken about this before in previous discussions that we've had when we talked about what the nature of the people that the schools produce. You have people who are clerks, you have people who never really have they have a proximity to power, but they're not playing any essential roles, right? So I think the economic power piece is very important. That an essential difference between our ruling class and that of the West is that the Western bourgeoisie has economic might that they can use to externalize, and do all of that. But I want to take you back to something that you mentioned when you historicized the relationship that the European bourgeoisie had with the public. I think that is very different from. Would you say that is the type of relationship that they had with the state? Because that is what Ekeh is concerned with here, right? That in Africa, there's like a dual conflicting morality. I owe my people, the Langese. I owe my people, the folks from Apache, right? I owe them that when I take on state power, when I'm in parliament, I need to give some things back to them. But at the same time, there's the reality of the state that goes beyond. And I love the fact that he starts the essay by defining what politics is. He says politics is anything that impinges on society, right? It goes beyond the individual and his small family, So there is that conflicting morality. But whereas in the West, this does not appear to be the case. They seem to be bound by a social contract that only leaves the civic realm, right, with no other affiliations beyond maybe the individual and their close family, right? So would you say that same yes, there's the exploitative relationship that we see at the height of industrial capitalism, but still the relationship between the general public and the state is not the type of relationship that you see on the African continent today, where I can loot the state, where I can loot the civic space without any remorse at all, and I continue, with no social sanctions. Are we being too generous to the Europeans in our analysis?
No, I do not think we're being too generous, but perhaps it would help to enlighten the discussion further if we understand exactly the scale of the problem we are faced with as Africans, especially in terms of defining belonging to the nation and how our concept of a nation is very, very much removed from the European concept of a nation for many reasons, but chief among which are that the European nation state developed organically. The Peace of Westphalia in, I think, the first half of the 17th century that brought an end to the 30 Years' War in Europe was reached or agreed upon to kind of to solidify this concept of national majorities. And Europe with about 27 countries across the continent, many of which are culturally and linguistically and ethnically homogeneous, is not accidental in its mapping. It is a very deliberate kind of pattern or territorial format that was developed after long periods of conflict, inter-national, inter-ethnic conflict. And, the European nation state, therefore, now finds it a lot easier to have its citizens, whether they belong to a bourgeois class or belong to a working class or even belong to the nobility, think of themselves as belongers in Sweden or in England or in France, because there is a kind of organic national identity, which existed in Africa as well, just that it existed on a very large scale. Each of the many so-called tribes, nations of Africa was independent, had territorial autonomy, had political and social and cultural autonomy until 1890 or thereabouts. And so this complete destruction of Africa's own organic nation building process and the imposition of multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, heterogeneous nation, or should I call them states? Because they're not nations. They're not nation states. They are just states that the Nigerians have referred to as geographic expressions, referring to their own country, saying Nigeria is not a nation, it's just a geographic expression. And they are right, sadly, they are right, as history and the trajectory of their society from that point onwards has shown. So that is a big difference that we have between African states and European nation states. And anywhere you look around the world, even when you look at the countries that have been able to overcome some of these contradictions in the global south, they have had to revert back to some form of organic national identity. China, has had to universalize Mandarin as a language of communication. They even went ahead as standardizing. They went ahead as far as standardizing the Mandarin alphabet and kind of suppressing Cantonese and other forms of divergent cultural expression. You see what they're doing in the north with the ethnic Uyghurs, Muslim minorities. The Han population and cultural identity is about 90% of Chinese demography, and I don't think that has in any slim way contributed to China's unification and nationalization project. Compare that with India, which is very multilingual and multi-ethnic and multicultural, and you see that despite the fact that India's bourgeoisie has been able to develop a huge capacity for capital accumulation, they are deliberately refusing to distribute that accumulated capital. India has probably more billionaires than the West put together, but then India also has more poor people as a statistical number than the whole of Africa combined. India is a country with a space project. They have their own satellites, and they are as advanced on the one hand as they are backward on the other. So I think it is very deliberate to have this multi-ethnic, multilingual kind of blueprint imposed on the global south. And perhaps finally, I would say that it is very instructive when you see how the colonization of Africa was prosecuted after Britain had an experience in India. If you read Mamdani, Citizen and Subject, he points out how British ethnographers and British colonial architects at the time, including Lugard and some of his predecessors, sat down and wrote clear policy on how to avoid the Indian disease in Africa. Because Britain had been to India for many decades before they first set foot on Africa to colonize Africa. So the British Raj in India taught them that you need to deliberately divide the local population when you are ruling them. You need to set up these very strong, exacerbated senses of identity that will keep the black majority of each colonized territory balkanized within the customary realms, within the tribal and ethnic realms that they occupied at the time we find them in. Perhaps it would have been good for us if territorial independence had been returned to these groups after the end of colonialism. Unfortunately, it wasn't. But in terms of avoiding what they call the Indian disease, which was the formation of a multi-ethnic kind of coalition that would grow into a middle class that is able then to accumulate capital, just like the Indian middle class. For all their redistributive failures, at least they see themselves at the level of the bourgeoisie, the Indian bourgeoisie, as belonging to this thing called India, and they are able to cooperate and collaborate to enforce the transfer of technology from the West and enforce the development of a domestic capital. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, comrade, I would add that the other thing, obviously, that they could have done was carry on cultural suppression to its logical conclusion. But they failed to do that, because if maybe they had managed to suppress, which is impossible, essentially, because you cannot do away with the entire cultural life of a people. But if they had managed to, carry on to the very end, to this logical conclusion, the suppression of cultural life, and to allow people then to conceive of themselves differently, maybe new terms and new categories, that could have also helped the problem. Obviously, now there's a reality that I've been thinking about a lot recently, is that colonialism actually did not take that long, if you think about it, or at least it did not take long enough to allow for the new identities to take root, right, and to then do away with our old affiliations, and now for us to conceive of ourselves differently after the experience. But I'll go back to what you said about the organic national identities that existed, as state formation was happening in Europe and in the West. I think now you see some of the challenges emerging with the current cultural conflicts that exist, right? You see that resistance towards, different groups, particularly with migration and all of that. But I still do not think, though, that we can elevate, even when migrants come into some of these countries. Now, look at America, for example, which is essentially a country of migrants, right? But the relationship that every single group that comes into such a country has to the state has not changed. They still have one public, essentially. There might be conflicts, but I think there's still a sense in which the relationship between the people and the state is that the people pay the taxes and the state delivers the services. And the state is not the primary source of accumulation and extraction, the way it happens for us in Africa, right? Whereby in most of our countries, obviously the government is the biggest employer, but also when let's say your relative is the head of the district, let's say service commission, and then they employ you, they expect that at some point you're also going to think about, you're going to think about your neighbor, you're going to think about your clan, and if you don't do it, there will be social sanctions, sufficient social sanctions in place to bring you back in line. So I think that piece is very important. I don't see Ekeh's analysis applying, very well to the European and the Western context, because it appears as if they have still managed to maintain a sense. It doesn't mean that there is no corruption. There's definitely a lot of corruption in the West. There's definitely a lot of corruption even in some of these South Asian countries these East Asian countries that we praise a lot because of how accelerated their development has been. But the relationship that colonialism created, in the state is very different. And also I think some of these societies have the benefit of homogeneity as well, ethnic homogeneity, even those that have managed to mobilize. But then the other piece, which will take me to another discussion point that we introduced as well, is the question of legitimacy. You pointed out rightly that China is employing violence. There's no doubt about it. I think it was when I was in undergrad that I discovered through a professor that taught me a grad class, that's really her life's work. All these different, when normally in Africa when you think of China, you think of one people, and I think maybe it's just because of how people look and everything. But you forget that there's very different identities, right? Very different. You can even call them ethnicities, right, that exist, different people ultimately in this huge country. But throughout history, you've seen that the state has taken on a homogenization project, right? Even when you go to a country like Ethiopia, not very far from us, you see that even the imposition of Amharic, that came in through violence, and the imagination of then an empire, one empire that speaks one language, that is, communicating with the same system. So it seems as if for the entire, or at least most of these post-colonial states, the way that they have found legitimacy is just through brute force and violence, right? Because the state cannot deliver anything else. America can sell people the idea of the American dream, that anybody can come, and if they bootstrap, that you will make it. In our countries, we are employing violence to then force people into line and to respect the civic public. So then that begs the question, comrade, how does decolonization work? How do we then imagine how do we move on from this reality, right? Whereby historically the state has maintained a colonial character, the use of force to enforce and to make people fall in line, to accept its rule, to accept its legitimacy. How do we reconcile those things in our imagination of how we move from where we've historicized that we've come from?
Very good question. I think the way forward is always important in conversations such as this to prevent us from turning into prophets of doom and serial lamenters. It's very important to infuse some optimism and sanguine conclusions. I'll start by also adding a little bit of evidential context to this. One of the most interesting facts that I discovered about Britain's own internal contradictions, which it tried to resolve through the colonization of the global south and the establishment of this worldwide British colonial empire, was its own question of national identity, because Britain is multinational historically. The Scots and the Welsh have always felt that the English were an imperial power. And over time, languages like Scotch and Welsh, which are different from English and unintelligible to English, have been suppressed and overtaken by English. And the Irish question is perhaps even sharper in terms of its expression of a national minority that feels completely excluded from the benefits of the national project in Great Britain. And for many years, Britain was weak as a collective because of those questions. The English were exploiting everyone else, and they ran the risk of this myth of Britain as a united kingdom breaking up. And I think as recently as perhaps 5 years ago, the Scots have been trying to vote in a referendum to exit the UK, because there are still some of those sentiments of national pride and national exploitation not being part of this British identity that the English kind of forced down everyone else's throat. But historically, Britain tried to resolve that through colonization, and there were very clear agreements between the English ruling class in, for example, giving large parts of India to the Scottish bourgeoisie and saying, this is now your reparations, so to speak. These are the reparations for us having come and conquered you and exploited you for all these years. You now have a whole subcontinent to exploit and do with as you wish. And so you see that, for example, many of the administrators in large parts of India, the resources that were taken from the exploitation of India went to specific parts of the British Empire as a reparative project. And so it's really important to see that that nation building all across the world is is about justice, it's about equality, and it's about deliberate policies on the part of the so-called national bourgeoisie to actually redistribute wealth and redistribute the benefits of civilization to minorities that might feel disenfranchised. And when one, of course, looks at some of the countries in Africa that may be justifiably called nation states, countries like Lesotho, countries like Botswana to an extent, countries like Swaziland, where the nation and the state coincide, one language, one people, single history, kind of legitimizing myth of the ruling class, despite the fact that they may not perform any better than the multinational states that exist in Africa. They don't have histories of the kind of violence and the kind of psychological feeling of disenfranchisement among the ordinary people as you experience in a country like Nigeria or in a country like Uganda, and you don't have the propensity to coups and a violent capture of the state in order to bring the primordial public into control of the tools of the civic, to use Ekeh's categorization. So you don't have one group saying we need to capture the state in order to share the cake. In order to share the cake, despite the fact that they may have a clear class divide among the bourgeoisie and the poor majority. It's going to be very unlikely for a Swazi military chief to say, let me overthrow the king, in order to redistribute wealth to my people. Because the king, despite being an exploiter, is his people. The myth is legitimate. The nation has a territory and a concept of its own. So going to the way forward, I think that Africa has to resolve this perpetual schizophrenia. Are we our so-called tribal identities? Are you able to hear me? Okay, the connection seems to be dropping.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Are you able to hear me?
Yeah, there was a...
Okay.
Yes, the connection was a bit shaky, but I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. Yes. So are we our so-called tribal identities, or are we these manufactured nations? Are we Ugandans or are we Baganda? Are we Langi? Are we Acholi? Are we Nigerians or are we Yoruba? Are we Igbo? Are we Hausa? You see? And the question, I guess, that was dramatically put by Ngugi was, why should 300,000 Icelanders be a nation while 50 million Yoruba are a tribe? Why? That is something that that Africa has to answer for itself. And we have to choose either to go forward or backward. Perhaps I should say to go left or right, in the sense of, do we just completely unify and create a new national myth based on race and geography and say this is a pan-African nation and Africa is our single legitimate identity? We can resolve internally how to have administrative borders, and then the whole concept of governors and regional kind of redistribution of the wealth, but the nation, a la China, is an African nation, borderless. Or do we go the other way of saying, let us go back to the primordial public as the basis of territory, as a basis of political, cultural autonomy, and then there the primordial publics can choose whether to confederate with each other as they see fit, as their interests align, instead of saying in parroting the the current line that was imposed on us by colonialism, saying that, oh, these borders are inviolable, the borders of 1960 or the borders of 1963 when the OAU was first formed. They are inviolable, they are inalienable, they are set in stone. Says who? Says who? See, they have not worked for us. If anything, they have been the greatest catastrophe that our people have experienced since the colonial project first interfered with our own organic trajectory of nation building and state formation.
So essentially, we have to decide how we want to proceed. Should we maintain the status quo, or should we now accept that we accept a supra-national identity? When you spoke of Pan-Africanism, I thought of, as we head towards the close, I thought of Nigeria in particular. You can think of Nigeria almost as a Pan-African project in and of itself, given the varying African identities and nationalities that exist within that single state, right? But obviously, they have responded to Ekeh's problem by institutionalizing it, because when you create a federal system, what you've essentially done is you've considered the existence of the primordial public and its tendencies. And what you're just saying is that now we need our people who will come in, and instead of serving a national agenda, they will be, attending to the different regional concerns. And you'll even see Ugandans who are, for example, advocating a federal system in the country. And then you ask yourself, okay, what are you trying to achieve with this, right? Are we trying to harken back to our regional tribal identities, or we're trying to transcend them in the interest of the national project? So I think that question is very important. And for Nigeria, for Nigeria as a case in point, then how do we? Is this the final destination, or we can still, with some moral courage, think about how we can transcend that identity as well, to imagine more of a unitary system that serves us all, with people that, because there's this aversion, comrade, there seems to be this aversion towards the state, and that's the only thing that makes us I'm sure if you introduce that conversation in Nigeria, obviously there are entrenched elites who have now, just like nationally, again against the Pan-African project, nationally there are now these entrenched elites who do not understand why you want us to embrace a bigger, even if it's in our national interest actually to do so, to think of a Pan-African identity or an African nation, right, or an African identity as opposed to a national identity. So there's obviously always those forces of resistance to the idea of a reimagination of how we can configure society. But what of the public itself? Like, are folks interested in us moving beyond a system that appears to have been serving them for a very long time? And we'll answer this question, and then we'll, try to call it a time on this discussion.
That's a very interesting angle that you bring in. Nigeria as a microcosm of what a future Pan-African confederation might actually look like. I would say that two things. One, the difference between what Nigeria has shown us as the possibility and a future Pan-African confederation would be the legitimization of the myth. How legitimate is the myth? Because using the concept of blackness as an organizing principle is definitely going to be a lot more effective than a manufactured identity like Nigeria, which, to the best of my recollection, is just a made-up word by Lugard's wife, who won some competition that I think the Times of London advertised in the 1930s or something, at the time when the Nigerian colonization was taking root. So the concept of race, I think, is a very strong and effective legitimizing myth, despite the fact that black people never looked at themselves as one monolith until they encountered European whiteness and its attempt to other them on the basis of their natural selection and genetic markers. Since that time, the concept has remained appealing, both at an emotional level, but also at a level of historical experience. You know, the transatlantic slave trade and the geographical proximity to each other, and also the fact that we are 50-something countries in Africa, but maybe about 37 of them with black majorities, which feel that they experience the same problem, they have the same position in the world, they are treated the same by everyone else. So there is a sense of a shared suffering and a shared modern history and a shared feeling of victimhood that can then be used to galvanize the Pan-African nation and bring them together. Now, it is, of course, an interesting subject why those same contradictions play out at a microcosm level, you know, like Nigeria or within Uganda. But, you know, that is something that requires deeper study and deeper analysis. Perhaps we will have another session, episode to answer that. But I think that it's very important not to wish away how strong a sense of self and a sense of identity that is rooted in history can be. And even countries that have attempted to give their national minorities the benefits of access and try to sweep away disenfranchisement through externalization of exploitation, through building up the capital base of the country enough, and then giving the national minorities enough access to capital and access to political power. Spain, for example, has been struggling with its own question of Catalonia, if I'm not mistaken. That's the region in Spain that tried to break away, you know, a few years ago. Countries like France, you know, for all its global and successful imperial project, has been struggling with the question of the Basque country for decades, with the Basques also trying to say, no, we are a different people and we want to break away from France, mainland France. We've already gone over Britain and its Irish and Scottish and Welsh minorities. And the USA as well, despite the fact that it has hoarded a lot of the world's wealth and then used that huge surplus to redistribute to its national minorities, as well as it continues to struggle with questions of belonging. And for example, the black minority in the US has always accused its bourgeoisie of selling out. You know, the black underclass always says, oh, these fellows are just getting preferential treatment through diversity, equity, and inclusion policies and affirmative action, and just taking 2 or 3 black faces and putting them in college and putting them in Congress and putting them in the Senate and even electing a black president. He's not eating on the behalf of all of us. You know, the black majority has always rejected that African American bourgeois pretensions to be their representative in the sharing of the American cake. So I think that questions of national identity and nation building have to be answered at the level of what is the relationship between the the public and its bourgeoisie, rather than the relationship between the public and the state. Once the public owns its bourgeoisie, then it will be very easy to have the bourgeoisie play a constructive role in dealing with the state. But once the bourgeoisie divorces itself from the public and then sees itself as simply a kind of a cartel that keeps the public suppressed while enjoying a kind of collaborative, or should I say a representational role with the state, then you cannot have a sustainable conversation around nation building held. Yep.
So just to try and summarize, the building of a national consciousness starts from how people relate with those who have, the most access to the state, and by extension the resources of the country, right, and of the national territory. So if we're thinking about how we proceed from what appears this impasse of conflicting moralities, we think about the relationship between the people and that class in power, as opposed to the relationship between the people and the state and how they relate to the state inherently. I think I'll just add to that in summary, and to think that it also justifies some of the efforts that we make here to say, if we are saying that we can either revert back to the old conflict, which seems not to be resolving itself, between the conflict of the primordial and the civic public, or we can head on towards Pan-Africanism, right? That if we can't resolve it at the national level, let's go full speed towards Pan-Africanism. I think all of this, and now we are mobilizing, as you mentioned, on the basis of race, but also on the basis of a shared historical grievance, right? Not only historical, contemporary grievance. Being countries that are still subject to exploitation, and you see that same problem with Latin America as well. I mean, if another sovereign state can pick up your own president in the middle of the night, and I saw when that happened, I saw the Argentinians celebrating, and I said, look at these ones. If they can take, what makes you think that in a couple of years it won't be your president that will be taken? So I think that appreciation of the role of mobilizing on shared grievances and shared problems, but to do that, it still will take the painstaking work that we are doing here at the Fourth Generation Initiative, which is to say, can we elevate our level of consciousness? Can we make ourselves historically aware people, right? So that when we talk of the necessity of unity, when we talk of the necessity of transcending what are primordial identities in the national interest, we all understand the terms and categories that we are dealing with. I think it's very useful work. It's very important work, and definitely we look forward to more engagements of this sort, because we need the right tools, we need the right frameworks to think about our problems. I think, and as we talked about in the introduction, it's good because now when we see corruption, when we see brazen corruption, we see somebody stealing 2 billion from OPM, and he's sleeping soundly at night, and his constituents are celebrating with him because they shared in the spoils, or his people stealing our iron sheets. Now we know you remember Ekeh, and you remember that there's a logic of two publics at play. Thank you very much, comrade. We'll reconvene again, and I don't know if there's any final words. Yeah.
No. Our audience will be hearing from us again. There's nothing final about this
For
conversation.
sure. These discussions cannot end. Yeah. So for sure, and we look forward again to your engagements over all our different platforms. We are firing on this year with the work of conscientization on our podcast here on the YouTube channel, with our platforms for writing as well. So we look forward to your engagement with that. and with all the programs that we'll be coming up with as the year and the years unfold. Otherwise, have a good one. Take care of yourselves, and see you all again next time.